introduce Olavo Marques. He is a postdoc at the, joint between Scripps and the Naval Postgraduate School. He's based at the Naval Postgraduate School. He got his Bachelor of Science at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil in oceanography, and then came to Scripps to do his PhD, which he obtained recently in 2021. He worked with Matthew Alford on internal waves and turbulence off the continental slope of Tasmania, but also participated in a number of collaborative studies on internal waves and turbulence across the globe, including the Pacific Ocean and the Beaufort Gyre. For his postdoc work, he's shifted his focus to waves on the ocean surface and is working on a large multi-institutional project in our own backyard, which he's going to tell us about today. So let's give a hand for Olavo.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Today I'm going to share with you some of my work on wave observations over rocky shores. I've been working on this project for a little over a year now since my postdoc started. I'm down in Monterey, and I'm happy to finally have had the chance to come up here to visit you at Moss Landing. So I will talk about observations that we made last summer in a series of experiments as part of the Rocky Shores Experiments and Simulations, or ROXY. This is a multi-institutional 5-year project funded by the Office of Naval Research, and it's led by Jamie McMahon at NPS. The overall goal of ROXY is to understand how the rocks on the rocky shores affects waves and currents in the coastal ocean. And one of the take-home messages of my talk today is that we know very little about this problem. So it's really necessary and a pleasure to be working with a large number of collaborators, each group in this project trying to address a different piece of this larger puzzle. So today I hope to convince you that rocky shores are important and we should do a lot more work on them. I'm going to describe the experiment we did last summer and tell a little bit about and tell some of the initial results on the surface wave transformation over those rocky bottoms. And I'm also going to highlight some of the things we're going to be doing in the next few years. Okay, so in the coastal ocean, there's lots of different processes that drive the circulation and mixing. You have wind-driven currents, you have tides, internal waves, river plumes. But when you get very close to the shoreline, it's the surface waves breaking in the surf zone that are the major driver of the circulation. So let's say that you care, for example, about sediment transport and beach erosion. Well, then you really have to know how the waves are approaching the shore and how they break at shallow water. In this image here, for example, you can see that there's different colors here. In these rip currents, that's because the waves are crashing, they resuspend the sand, and then the rip currents carry the sand offshore here. Another reason why I'm going to care about the surf zone, here in this image, we have an estuary carrying pollution into the ocean, and then that plume spreads. And how that plume spreads partly depends on the waves crashing here along the shoreline. Waves can also impact coastal ecosystems in a variety of ways. In rocky shores, a lot of organisms have a larval stage, and those larvae are going to be carried around. So the transport of them can depend on how the wave conditions. There's also a long literature on how waves impact coral reefs. For example, in many situations, they can drive the circulation on coral reefs, which can be important for nutrient availability, where you have nutrient-poor waters, such as over atolls. Moreover, corals can act as protectors of coastline. In this image here, let's go back. In this image here, you see the waves crashing on the edge of the coral reef and not on the shoreline where people live. So most of that energy gets dissipated offshore before it reaches human settlements. However, with increasing stresses on coral reefs, if they die and do not recover, then maybe you expect that these waves are going to reach the shoreline and increase the vulnerability of population. Okay, so to understand, for all of these reasons, you want to have different models of the waves in the near shore. And to do that, you need to know the conditions of the waves coming in. Far offshore, the waves, they don't interact with the bottom, but at some point here, the water becomes shallow enough, and then the waves are going to respond to the bathymetry. Eventually, when the water gets too shallow, then those waves break in the near shore. So in this cartoon here, one of the features of this cartoon, and in all of our models of waves in the near shore, we have this very smooth bottom that only changes over very large scales. And this smooth bottom leads to a negligible friction between the wave motion and the bottom of the ocean. So in this case, what happens is that the waves are going to come in. As the water gets shallow, the waves are going to get slower, the wave height is going to increase, and they're eventually going to break and dissipate all of their energy through breaking in the surf zone. As the waves propagate here and fill the bottom, they are going to be transformed in a variety of ways, and that's what I'm referring to as wave transformation. Okay, so let's say we want to apply this type of model here to waves around the Monterey Peninsula. So here's just a Google Earth image, and I'm going to show bathymetry at a few different locations. North of the peninsula, this is a bird's eye view of the bathymetry, and if you look at the bathymetry from the side, so here is just some depth contours. The shoreline here is this red line here on the bottom. The scale on these axes is about a kilometer and a half here in the x-axis, and a kilometer in the y-axis. And so from these contours, you can see that we have a very smooth bathymetry on these sandy beaches in the Monterey Bay. So that model that I showed in the previous slide can work pretty well in this type of environment. Okay, and let's now look at the bathymetry at somewhere here around the Monterey Peninsula. Well, that's what it looks like. And I hope you can see that rocky bottoms are not smooth. The bathymetry here is a lot more complex than when you have on a sandy beach. Therefore, all of those models that we use and work very well on sandy beaches, there's a very good chance that they're not going to work on rocky bottoms. And in fact, I'm going to show you that they don't work very well. So here, just again, the map here in the bathymetry, we're seeing the greatest depth is about 35 meters in this map, and you can see all of these rocks underwater in this bathymetry map. You might expect this if you've been to the Monterey coastline. There's lots of different spots where you can see these large rocks, several meters high. And those rocks that you see on the shoreline also basically exist down on the continental slope, and that's why you have this very complicated bottom. So to understand the waves in the coastal ocean, that's where RockSig comes in. And our first experiment, we did our first experiment last summer over a month. We made lots of observations at 2 sites at Asilomar State Park, as well as along near the China Rock Vista Point in the 17-mile drive, Scenic Drive. There are many different components to these observations. I'm involved with a large-scale array. So we deployed about 70 moorings in those 2 sites, a lot of them deployed from boats. Every time after we deployed those moorings with the instruments, divers went down to check if the instruments were in good spots, or if they didn't tip over if we deployed them over a rock. They did a really good job in making sure that we got the best data as possible. We also did some deployments off of the shore, so you just carry those instruments from the shoreline and deploy them in spots to know what's happening very close to the shoreline. There are also different components. One of them here is the remote sensing. So there were a few groups making observations of waves from drones, and also from a video system that is installed in a tower during the duration of the experiment. There's another component, is what we call the small-scale array. So while in the large-scale array, we're looking at wave transformation on the scales of hundreds of meters to a kilometer. In the small-scale array, they just deployed a lot of moorings around a single rock. So here's where they deployed the moorings. So in this map here, there's just a bathymetry map, and the scale here on the x and y axis are about 40 meters in each direction. Another component of the project is the numerical modeling aspect of it. And in one direction, they're making predictions. They're can be useful for us in the field to guide where we should make our measurements. But ultimately, you also expect to learn a lot of about wave transformation from the measurements, so we can also improve these models. So I'm going to focus. So I've been working on with the data from the large-scale array. These are the moorings that we deployed at both sites. At the Asilomar, we had one cross-shore line of moorings, and on the China Rock, we were able to do more extensive measurements. So there we have both information, both the cross-shore variability as well as on the along-shore direction. You can see, previously I mentioned that our models assume that the bathymetry is very smooth and only change on very large scales. But here, as you can see, you have this very corrugated shoreline, and on the scale of hundreds of meters, you have these different headlands and embayments, which can lead to which can have different impacts on the wave transformation. I'm also noting here that these Google Earth images are from winter, when we have much larger waves than during their experiment. So if you look at the foam here and infer that, oh, this is the width of the surf zone, well, in our experiment, for most of the time, we probably had surf zones much narrower than what you see in these images. And I'm going to come back to this later. So for here, you can see that we have, based on this, we have several instruments on the surf zone, but most of them are outside of the surf zone. Let me now give you just an example of the instruments that we deployed. Basically, in the large-scale array, we have a whole bunch of wave buoys, pressure sensors, and ADCPs. So here's one type of wave buoy that we deployed. In this case here, the wave buoy itself is this yellow ball here that's the size of a basketball. And in this case, it is actually cabled all the way to the bottom where there's a pressure sensor there. And we deployed in this location here. Another example here that we deployed nearby an ADCP. So this is a photo of, this is the top of the ADCP that is mounted on this bracket, on this structure that we developed, so that we can deploy them on top of rocks, and hopefully most of them stayed there in the spot, although some of them moved around with some big waves that came in. So this is one example of the data that we get out of these instruments. So here in the top, here I'm just showing a time series for about 2 minutes. On the top, it's the data from wave buoy, and in the bottom is the data from the ADCP. So here, if you just focus on the top, if you just here focus on the top, you can see that the buoy is just going up and down, and that's what it's being shown here in this time series. It goes up by half a meter and then goes down another half a meter. So the wave height during this time, during these 2 minutes, is about 1 meter. In the case of the ADCP here, the y-axis is this height above the bottom, and the colors here is just the cross-shore velocity. So every time the waves come, the crest of the wave comes, you see onshore velocities, and when the trough of the waves comes, you see these offshore velocities with the amplitude of about plus or minus a meter per second. And note here that this ADCP here was deployed at about 12 meters water depth, and note that this velocity signal extends pretty much all the way to the bottom, so you might expect that it's going to interact with the rocks at that location. From these measurements, you're also measuring, you also have some directional information of the waves. So now I'm just plotting here not the vertical displacement of the buoy, but the horizontal displacement of the buoy in these x and y axis here. So the scale here in this plot is about 3 meters on each axis, and you can see that from the pattern of those data points, you can infer that the wave is propagating from the northwest to the southeast towards the coast. Now, in my work, when I talk about wave transformation, I'm not talking about the transformation of individual waves. I'm talking about the transformation of the statistics of the waves. So to quantify the statistical wave height, we use something like the significant wave height that you can compute from a frequency spectrum of the waves. So on the x-axis here, we have frequency. Frequency increases to the right. or equivalently, I'm showing here the period here, so the period decreases as you go to the right. On the y-axis, I have the variance of the vertical displacement of the waves. So here in this case, we have in this frequency spectrum that I computed here for 1 hour of data, this is a general description of the waves where you have this higher frequency waves that are called the C waves, and then we have the lower frequency waves that are the swell that usually propagate from far away. And then when you integrate the spectrum, you compute the area under this graph, then you can compute what we call the significant wave height, which is which is the height of the highest 1/3 of the waves coming in. Okay, so that's spectrum from only 1 hour of data. We can do that for an entire time series, for the entire duration of the experiment. That's what it looks like. So on the x-axis is time here, the 1 month duration of our experiment. And on the y-axis now it's the period. So the shorter period waves are, on the C waves are higher above here, and the swell is this lower band. This is data from one of the Ori buoys that were located offshore, so before significant wave transformation happens. You can then integrate this spectra here at different frequency bands to calculate the significant wave height. That's what this middle plot shows. So the black line is sort of the total significant height over the entire, for all frequencies. And the red line is just for the C waves, and the blue line is just for the swell band. And we can see that most of the waves that we have there are C waves that are locally generated. The wave height, the minimum here is about 1/2 meter, and it goes up to about 1.5, 2 meters. And we have these different events here when different weather systems come by, then that's when then we had higher significant wave heights. You can also see, if you zoom in this time series, sometimes you see these very regular spikes, like, for example, and this time here, and these spikes here. If you've been there, or if you've been here in the afternoon, you know that there's a strong sea breeze. So when wind picks up in the afternoon, you get some higher waves here that are associated with these peaks. So yeah, so I guess one thing that I'm highlighting here is that these conditions for the summer, we have medium to small waves. Okay, now these are observations from the buoy located offshore. Well, what does the wave transformation look like as it gets progressively closer to shore? This is what I'm going to show in the next few slides. So on the right, I'm showing the significant wave height for the duration of experiment, and that's data from this wave buoy that was located over here. And in the bottom here, what I'm going to show is that I'm just going to take the ratio of the significant wave height from one mooring relative to this one here. So in this case here, I'm just dividing the time series by itself. I get 100%. So if I go get data from other moorings on shore, you see now that the wave height gets a little bit smaller in this case. In particular, this mooring here is located at about 10 meters of water depth. So from offshore into 10 meters, there's only a small decrease. As you look closer and closer, now you get a more substantial decrease of the significant wave height. And I'm going to note again that most of our moorings were located offshore of the surf zone. But let's say that you were to hypothesize that a lot of this decrease was due to wave breaking in the surf zone. How do you address that? Well, the wave modeling in the surf zone, there's this idea of wave saturation here that works very well on sandy beaches. Basically what that is that when you are in the surf zone, all the waves are breaking, and then the height of those breaking waves is linearly proportional to the bottom depth. So this was an experiment done several years ago on this beach here. So they had, similar to us, they had measurements in a bunch of different locations. In their case, more focused inside the surf zone. So in this diagram here on the right, they're plotting bottom depth in the x-axis, and this spans about 4 meters. And on the y-axis is the wave height. It goes up to a meter, a little bit over a meter. And so when you have observations in the surf zone, they all fall in this line here. So the wave height never gets bigger than this threshold value. And there are different symbols here. Those different symbols are observations from different days. So there were certain days when the waves coming in were smaller. Those are like these symbols over here. And then when you have conditions when the waves are bigger, like here, what happens is that the surf zone gets wider. And so the waves break over a longer distance. However, all of the observations inside the surf zone, they all fall in this line here that we call the wave saturation. Well, now I'm going to show you a plot similar to this, but with our observations. And that's what it looks like. So I just got the data from the previous slides, and I plotted in a similar way here. So note that the x-axis here in my plot goes considerably deeper than what they have here. And what you see is that while there's a lot of scatter here in this figure, that's because all of these moorings located offshore, they're outside of the surf zone, so the wave height is not limited at all by the water depth. When you look at just the time average of these data, then you see that, well, there is maybe a little bit of a decrease of significant wave height off of here, but onshore of 10 meters, I think it's pretty robust that there is a decrease of the significant wave height, which is pretty deep. I mean, the surf zone here in this case only extends to about 2-3 meters deep. So so the decrease that we see in our data is happening over a region that is outside of the surf zone. So that wave saturation line here that I'm plotting this similarly, that line here on my data set, and you can see that for all of these moorings, we never really reach, even those moorings closer to shore, we never really reach these wave saturation curve. So this here supports that the decrease here of the significant wave height is happening outside of the surf zone. Okay, but looking at wave height is not the best. If you want to develop a wave model, instead of looking at significant wave height, you should be looking at the wave energy flux. And the wave energy flux is simply the product of the wave energy, which is proportional to wave height squared, times the speed at which the energy propagates, and that's the group velocity. So that's what the energy flux is, and a model of wave transformation is going to relate how the wave energy flux changes in the cross-shore direction, and the dissipation of that energy is often parameterized in terms of both the bottom friction and in terms of wave breaking. In traditional wave models, this bottom friction here is negligible, and all of the dissipation is due to wave breaking. But for now, let me just say that both of these dissipation terms are 0, and say that the energy flux is conserved. Say that the energy flux is conserved. And what I'm going to show here is what happens to the waves as the water depth gets shallower. So if you have constant F and you have constant ECG, then in this case, the energy flux at this location here is going to be equal to the energy flux at this location. But because the water depth is getting shallower, the group velocity is getting smaller, and therefore the wave height, the energy density is going to increase. So now, instead of looking at significant wave height, I'm going to show you how the energy flux changes as you go progressively onshore. This is similar. So but here, just to make things simpler, I'm just taking data from 1 hour in this particular day here, which had like these large, medium-large waves of offshore this. Oh, sorry, let me backtrack for a moment here. On the top here, these are cross-shore profiles, and on the top here, I'm showing the bathymetry. In the middle, I'm showing the significant wave height, and in the bottom, I'm showing the energy flux. Oops. In the bottom here, I'm just calculating significant wave height and energy flux from 1 hour of data here, just to make things simpler. And I have all of these moorings here that I took from from one of our cross-shore arrays here at China Rock. Okay, so what you can see here is that offshore, from all the way offshore down to about 400, 300 meters, the energy flux here decreases only very slightly. But at about 200, 250 meters, that's when the energy flux starts decreasing. So that gives you an indication that here's when you have dissipation of the waves. And that happens again around that strong dissipation starts happening at around, in this case here, it's 7, 8 meters water depth. So I can compare these observations to a simple model of wave shoaling. That's what I'm doing here. So basically, I took those very simple equations from the previous slides, and I said, okay, the waves are going to come in, and the energy flux is going to be constant until at some point the waves are going to get significantly big, and then they're going to apply that wave saturation rule, and then the energy flux is going to dissipate through wave breaking. And so you can see from the blue and the orange lines that they look very different, right? So this is what I'm referring to earlier. If you have just wave breaking, the dissipation in the surf zone is going to happen in a very narrow region. And what we observe is that the dissipation starts much earlier. Now the question is, okay, so if we're saying that there's dissipation here and that's not associated with wave breaking, so is that associated with bottom friction? Ooh, there's something missing here, but there it is. So you can expect that maybe bottom friction, intuitively maybe say, oh yeah, bottom friction should be very large because you have these very large rocks, and so as the wave currents flow over the rocks, you should expect larger friction than on sandy beaches. How to address this? So what models usually do is that they assume that this dissipation through bottom friction has this recipe here, is this formula, and it's proportional to the velocity cubed near the bottom, as well as this friction factor. And this friction factor is going to be related to a few things, but it's primarily going to be associated with the smoothness of the bottom. So on sandy beaches, this FW is very large. So the first question is, is the attenuation of the energy flux consistent with bottom friction? To do that, all we need to do is to compare our measurements of the attenuation of the energy flux with the cubed of the near bottom velocity. And are they correlated? And that's the time series that I'm showing on the right here. So there is one curve for the change in energy flux, another for this dissipation as proportional to the cube velocity, and there's a pretty good correlation between them. I should say, yeah, that for the change in energy flux, you have to take observations from 2 different moorings. In this case, in this case here, the pair of moorings that I took are these 2 here. Another thing that I should point out is that now in this plot I have 2 different curves, a blue and red curve. And this blue curve was the same as from the previous plot. And in the red curve, it's when you have smaller waves. So you can see that for a pretty different range of, for a wide range of wave conditions, we see this dissipation that starts to happen around here in the same region. So this attenuation here, for the most part, is apparently we can explain it with this formulation entirely due to bottom friction and no wave breaking. Now, how much from this comparison here? Now we want to estimate what this friction factor looks like, and that's basically here and that's what I did here in these plots. So now I'm getting the data from this. I'm getting the data from this time series here, and all I'm doing here is plotting one against the other, and these are these scatter plots. Each scatter plot is for a different pair of moorings along that cross-shore transect, and then the slope of this line gives me an estimate for this friction factor. And in each of these cases, we have something like 4.7, 2.6, 1.3 here. So are these large or small values? Well, in the literature, here are some values here. On sandy beaches, we have something very small that's negligible for wave transformation models. On coral reefs, we have something like on the order of 0.1 to 1. And on these sort of rougher coral reefs, these large values that people have found, it's on the order of 1 to 5. So we're getting numbers here of these friction factors that are consistent with sort of the largest values in the literature. And we think that's very exciting because there's very little work. There's substantial work on coral reefs, but very little on rocky shores. So maybe we're now working on making the connections between how the dissipation happens on rocky shores versus on the coral reefs, and whether one has more friction than the other and how that happens. That's pretty much most of what I had to say. Here's just highlights of the next experiments we're going to be doing. So I said throughout the talk that we measured summer conditions where the waves are medium to small. If you've been around here for the last winter, we had some pretty nasty waves. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing this summer and fall is to deploy our instruments, but we're going to do sort of this long-term deployment where we're going to have the instruments, and they're going to sample more or less. They're not going to sample continuously. They're going to take some time between measurements. So then the battery can last for longer, and then hopefully a storm will come by, large wave events, and we're going to get some nice measurements of the wave transformation with much larger waves. Also, next year, we're going to be doing another experiment similar to from last year, but like a more intensive 1-month experiment. But this time is going to be down in Garrapatta State Park, where you have these cliffs, these much larger rocks. It's a similar environments in some ways, but also different in others. It's going to be very, very interesting to know what the differences and similarities are. And in case if you're interested in participating in some of this work, you can get in touch with me or get in touch with Jamie. We definitely have some room, and depending if you're interested, you can be a part of it. So just here are my take-home messages. So there's all of these classic wave transformation models developed in the 80s. They work really well for sandy beaches. After all, they were developed for sandy beaches. They assumed a very simple bottom, which is not what we have in many places in the world, for example, here down in the Monterey Peninsula. So these models, they shouldn't work there. They do not work, and we're working to improve those models. In particular, most of the wave energy is dissipated by bottom friction and not by wave breaking. And yeah, we're still doing a lot more work. I tried to show here some of the nicer plots that tell a more coherent story. I could show you lots of plots with lots of questions that I'm still working and lots of confusions that we still have, so that will keep me busy for some time. And yeah, thank you all. I'll take any questions you can.
I am not a geologist by any means, but
Me neither.
great. So when I think of sandy beaches, I imagine the bottom topography to be relatively similar to beaches. But when I think of rocky bottoms, I'm like, well, there's different sizes of rock, there's lots of different types of rock, there's various life. And so how much do you think that these results hold for rocky bottoms in general? Like, what would you expect to be different between different bottoms?
Yeah, great. That was one of the things that we pitched in the proposal for doing different experiments that we can know. So yeah, we can sample different conditions. So there is, I don't have an answer yet for you, hopefully in a few years. But one of the things that you can do, well, as a physicist, sometimes you simplify things. And sometimes that's bad, sometimes that works well. On coral reefs, for example, there's lots of different coral structures, but sometimes you can say, oh, maybe things are statistically homogeneous. Maybe there's sort of this roughness that is constant, and then we can make progress on a particular type of model. Let's see if I can show you a figure here. Here it is. This is a map of the roughness in those locations and that China rock. And we had this nice system here to measure the bathymetry at very shallow water where boats can't reach. So you can see here that in some places, maybe here you could say that this roughness is maybe about constant and large. But as you go here, you have like some sandy channels between the rocks, and it's different anymore. So even within our own region, we got to be a little careful in terms of comparing what happens to the waves in one site versus the other. And I guess to just wrap up this long answer, I guess combining the model with the observations is a key step in trying to generalize our results and seeing how our results, how our results compare with the models and how to work with them together to come up with generalizations.
Hi. Actually, I want to follow up on your question. And actually, I'm a geologist, so. And this is fascinating. I actually followed the first part of your presentation when I was driving here. So I might have missed some stuff. I was rushing to get here earlier. So there are a couple of things. So first, actually the question was really relevant. Scale. How friction related to a rocky bottom changes in relation to geological features, and so you have very different types of rock types. Especially we're working there around Azilomar because you have a transition between two important geological units. So you have granodiorites to the north and actually sandstone, this Carmelo Formation to the south. So in the same way.
South where?
Was that?
I'm learning with your questions. So
Yeah,
south where is the?
So Azilomar is basically where the transition occurs. Mm-hmm. So you have igneous, non-bedded, very fractured rocks to the north, to the point, and then when you go to the south, you transition to the sandstones, bedded sandstone. Okay. And the bedding actually changes. So there's that further complexity. But this is to say that you can look at the same wave regime across a very different scale of features on the seafloor. So that's something, that place is really a really good spot to work. And I actually worked on mapping those rocks myself. So I did a lot of roughness studies there. And we can talk more about that. Yeah, and so and the other thing, why Garrapada?
There's a few different sites in the proposal. Like one of them is China Rock, and Solomar was more in terms of the bottom slope there in these locations is more gentle than Garrapada, which is a lot steeper. And there you have those cliffs, structures.
So that's you're right on the fault line there, right? You're right on the fault line. That's where a major offshore fault comes on land. And it's completely different rock type. So, I mean, if you're trying to understand, to deconvolve all the different factors, you're really comparing very different geological situations. So, again, I can give you more information on Garrapada as well.
Yeah.
But just one last question. What is the scale, in your opinion, in which roughness in rocky, bottoms influence, the wave behavior? I mean, what are we talking about? Centimeters, meters, tens of meters?
Yeah, great question. I still don't have an answer for that, but let's see. The way that as I read more papers and compare with the data and talk to the other folks in Roxy, my general understanding is that basically there's two sides of modeling the wave transformation. You have just as if the water depth just gets shallower, like have a large rock and then the water depth goes from like 8 meters to 4 meters, just that water depth change alone is going to change
the wave characteristics, the wave height, similar to what I showed before, and not necessarily not necessarily the roughness at smaller scales. And then in addition to that change in water depth, then there's also the roughness of the rocks on the scales of meters, maybe up to 10 meters. On scale of meters, let's put that as a number. And then at those scales, then you can have processes that are going to, depending on the roughness, it's going to change how the waves are attenuated. But I think there's these two parts of it. There's both the total water depth, that's going to change the wave height, and there's also the more smaller scale turbulent processes developing over that roughness.
Can I, man, sorry, we have time, so there's one. Can you go back to the bathymetric map you had for Asilomar, for China Rock?
This is one of them.
Yeah, you had another one where it actually shows the location of your
The
experiments.
roughness?
Yeah, because there's another thing that I just want to kind of find out. So, there's a lot of work that's been done by USGS in that area. They've been doing fantastic work. So, yeah, so where the location of the black spots are, so this is one of those submerged streams, right? So all that, all that shelf used to be emerged until a few thousand years ago. So I would like you to pay attention to the fact that you might actually be seeing also some effects due to some channelized kind of, feature on the seafloor. So there are all these ancient streams that used to drain from the Monterey Peninsula, and now they are submerged.
Yeah, cool.
That's one of them.
So yeah, this is a little bit misleading because this plot is from China Rock. I only plotted some of the mornings. But yeah, we definitely see some effect on that, and that maybe I can share this plot from one of our collaborators. Where is it? It's probably here. Yeah, so that's exactly what you're talking about.
There you go. Yeah.
These are observations with some very nice techniques. Try to map the flow field at the surface. So this is the little bay here in the Asilomar, and these streaks here they are related to the velocity here. So the red dots indicate the velocity going offshore. The blue color is just the velocity going onshore, and you have the circulation patterns, and then this rapid flow here is happening in one of those features that you're just talking about.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So I know you'll be looking at wave transformation more towards like the winter season and a future experiment. How would you predict that location offshore where the energy dissipates to shift? Would it be more onshore or offshore with the higher energy waves?
Yeah, good question. It should be more offshore, I would guess. We still need to kind of write down some equations and work and come up with a better real prediction. But as the waves get bigger, then that as the waves get bigger, then that velocity near the bottom is also going to increase, and then you're going to have more dissipation. So that region of dissipation is going to extend further offshore. However, there's two aspects of it. One is that, well, maybe you have more dissipation, but if the waves are a lot bigger, well, we saw what happened this winter. They're still going to be very big when they get to the shoreline and even further onshore, further into the land. The other thing is that, which is kind of curious, is that in this analysis here, I've done a calculation where I say that this FW is constant, but a lot of the discussion in this literature is actually how do you parameterize this FW. So here I'm using observations, but if you would like to say, okay, this FW depends on the roughness of the bottom in a certain way, and then we can just map this FW for different regions without having to deploy instruments. So with bigger waves, this FW is likely also to change. So to conclude my answer, yes, we expect that the dissipation is going to happen further offshore, start happening further offshore. However, there are a few different other factors that we need to account for when we come up with our wave transformation model for water sharks.
Questions or questions on Zoom? I have a question. So you showed for your measurements a few different friction factors that were very different. They're all large, they're different.
Yeah.
Do you think those different friction factors are because the shoreline is getting rockier? Or do you think maybe the fact that the rocks are taking up a larger fraction of the water column is also playing a role there? The roughness at the same time, the roughness is extending into a larger fraction of the water.
Yeah, good question, Tom. I don't know the answer to that yet. But I think that's, I think we really need to get to that wave transformation model, like some simple equations, just because there are these competing factors. So the waves are gonna, as they dissipate, they're gonna, on one hand, at shallower water, the roughness is gonna extend further into the water column, so you might expect that the roughness is gonna be larger. At the same time, as those waves come in, they also dissipate, so their energy gets smaller, so the total dissipation also gets smaller. So, yeah, so far I'm just on the level of, okay, these are all large values, and the next step is to quantify why there are differences between the sites.
All right, last chance.